The four-star general lifted his crystal glass high above the crowd, his gaze fixed on a single woman in the ballroom. As the chatter faded into complete silence, he broke into a grin and delivered a toast that made my husband nearly inhale his bourbon. "She saved every career in this room," he declared. For one suspended moment, nobody stirred. Then, more than 200 military leaders, Pentagon officials, retired generals, and defense executives rose as one. The applause thundered through the space, drowning out the clink of glasses and the scrape of chairs against gleaming floors. All eyes turned toward me, and I could see recognition flickering across countless faces. Across our table, my husband Derek choked violently into his linen napkin, his complexion draining to an ashen white. Barely 30 minutes earlier, he had leaned in close, his voice low enough for only me to catch, and said, "Please don't make a scene tonight. These people are in a different league entirely." Those words had seared themselves into my memory, every syllable, every inflection. And now, as the ovation swelled around us, I found myself wondering if he was replaying them too. But before I unveil what transpired that evening, let me take you back to where our story truly begins. My name is Margaret Holloway. I am 62 years old, and I dedicated 31 years of my life to the United States Army, most of them within military intelligence. For reasons that remain classified, there are operations I will never discuss, individuals I cannot name, and decisions whose full weight will never be publicly understood. Yet this narrative isn't really about state secrets or covert missions. It speaks to something far more universal, something playing out in thousands of households across America every single day. It is about invisibility, particularly the kind that exists within the very walls where we should feel most seen. Derek and I had been married for 35 years. We met in our youth, long before promotions, before children, before mortgages and retirement portfolios complicated our existence. Back then, he celebrated my ambition. He boasted about my service at dinner parties, pinned medals on my dress uniform with genuine pride, and wrote heartfelt letters during my deployments. For a significant stretch, we were true partners. At least, that was my firm belief. But somewhere along the way, things began to shift, not abruptly, but gradually, insidiously, like wallpaper fading under relentless sunlight. After I retired from active duty, Derek carved out a lucrative career in defense consulting. He possessed natural charm and sharp intelligence, qualities that endeared him to Washington's elite. Invitations began to flood in. Charity galas, networking soirees, fundraisers, and military appreciation dinners. Each year elevated his standing, and each year my own accomplishments seemed to diminish in his estimation. At first, the slights were subtle. When someone inquired about my former profession, Derek would interject smoothly, "Oh, she did some government work." 31 years of service, compressed into 5 dismissive words. I would smile politely and let it pass. Then came the jokes. "Don't ask Margaret about her job, she'd have to eliminate us," he would quip, eliciting chuckles from the crowd. I laughed along, but after hearing that same punchline dozens of times, it lost all humor. During one dinner party, a retired colonel asked where I had been stationed. Before I could utter a word, Derek cut in, "Honestly, nothing worth mentioning." The colonel's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and I felt something fracture deep within me, just a hairline crack. Nothing worth mentioning? I had spent years away from my family, missing birthdays, anniversaries, and Christmas mornings, watching my children grow up through grainy photographs sent during deployments. Yet I never argued or corrected him. I convinced myself it wasn't worth the confrontation, but each small dismissal accumulated like drops of water slowly eroding stone. Then the invitation arrived, the annual Defense Leadership Gala, one of the most prestigious military gatherings in the region. retired generals, active duty commanders, senior Pentagon staff, all dressed in their finest uniforms and polished footwear. Derek seemed unusually animated when he received it. "We should attend," he announced. "You mean you should attend," I replied evenly. "No," he said with a casual wave. You can accompany me. You can accompany me. Not, we'll go together. Not, we'll attend as a couple." I was an accessory, a handbag, a simple +1. I studied his face carefully. He didn't even register his own phrasing. That absence of awareness stung more than any deliberate insult could. In the week leading up to the event, I seriously contemplated staying home. But something shifted inside me. Not anger, not vengeance, but something quieter and more profound. I was exhausted, weary of justifying myself, weary of proving my worth, weary of reminding people, especially my own husband, of who I truly was. So I resolved to attend the gala. I would wear my gown, I would smile, and for once, I would stop correcting anyone. If people recognized me, wonderful. If they didn't, that was equally acceptable. I wasn't going to impress anyone, nor was I going to defend my value. The evening arrived. Derek adjusted his tuxedo before the mirror while I stood beside him in my evening dress. He barely glanced my way. Then, as we entered the glittering ballroom, filled with decorated officers and dignitaries, he leaned toward me and whispered words that would echo in my mind forever. "Please don't embarrass me tonight. These people are out of your league entirely." I met his gaze, smiled serenely, and said absolutely nothing. Because 20 minutes later, the entire room would discover something my husband had long forgotten, and so would he. The ballroom blazed beneath enormous crystal chandeliers, their light dancing off rows of metals and polished brass. Military uniforms dominated the space, and the air hummed with conversation, clinking glasses, and the mellow strains of a jazz quartet. I followed Derek through the crowd, or perhaps I should say I trailed behind him, because that's precisely how it felt. Everywhere we turned, people greeted him warmly. Defense contractors, former officers, government liaisons. Derek was thoroughly in his element. He shook hands, regaled groups with stories, accepted compliments, and introduced himself repeatedly. And whenever someone glanced my way, the routine repeated itself. "This is my wife, Margaret." Nothing more, no mention of my service, no reference to my rank, no acknowledgement of the 3 decades I spent in uniform. Just Margaret. At one juncture, a retired Navy admiral asked how we first met. Derek launched into an elaborate tale before I could draw breath. Everyone laughed appreciatively. The admiral nodded politely, then turned to me. "So, what line of work did you pursue?" I opened my mouth to respond, but Derek interjected smoothly. "Government work." The admiral smiled. "That's rather broad." Derek chuckled. "Trust me, she prefers not to discuss it." The group tittered. I smiled my practiced smile, the one women perfect when correcting someone would only exacerbate the situation. But inside, something ached, not because strangers didn't know my history, but because my husband did, and acted as though it held no significance. I excused myself and drifted toward the periphery of the ballroom. A waiter glided past with a tray of champagne. I took a flute and found a quiet alcove near a tall window. Outside, Washington's lights twinkled against the velvet sky. For a few precious moments, I stood there, observing, reflecting, remembering. There was a reason I rarely discussed my career. Most civilians assume secrecy is thrilling. In reality, it can be profoundly isolating. Many of my most consequential actions could never be mentioned across dinner tables. There would be no books, no interviews, no public acclaim. That was simply part of the vocation. Years earlier, Long before retirement, I had been assigned to a small intelligence task force. A crisis had erupted overseas, details of which remain restricted. What I can disclose is this. Several senior military leaders were operating on catastrophically flawed intelligence. If their decisions had been executed, careers would have imploded, promotions rescinded, reputations decimated, and, perhaps worse, a compact team of us worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. Weeks stretched into months, sleep became a luxury, and families became distant voices on crackling phone lines. Eventually, we unearthed the facts, and more critically, we substantiated them. The correction averted a catastrophe. The individuals whose livelihoods had hung by a thread never forgot. Most never publicly acknowledged it. Neither did I. That was how military professionals operated. You performed your duty, and you moved forward. The mission outweighed personal recognition. At least, that was my enduring conviction. A burst of laughter snapped me back to the present. Across the room, Derek was holding court once more, surrounded by an admiring cluster. He looked content, confident, consequential. I watched him for a moment. Then something unexpected transpired. An older man, perhaps 70, tall and ramrod straight, with the unmistakable bearing of a career officer, stopped mid-stride. His eyes locked onto mine with startling intensity. For an instant I didn't recognize him. Then he smiled, and recognition flooded back. General Robert Thornton, now retired, but once among the Pentagon's most revered figures. For a fleeting second he appeared genuinely stunned. Then he crossed the ballroom directly toward me, not toward Derek, toward me. "Margaret Holloway," he said warmly. I laughed softly. "It's been a while, General." "A while," he echoed, shaking his head. "Good heavens, I haven't seen you in nearly 15 years. We chatted for several minutes, touching on family, retirement, and grandchildren. The typical topics of those who have already spent decades proving their mettle. Yet something lingered in his eyes. Respect, authentic, unfeigned respect. The kind that cannot be counterfeited. The kind earned through years of trust and competence." Soon, another retired officer joined us. Then another. Suddenly, I found myself encircled by individuals I hadn't seen in decades. People who remembered. People who understood. Across the ballroom, I noticed Derek watching. His expression was puzzled, not alarmed, not threatened, just bewildered, as though he couldn't fathom why senior officers kept gravitating toward me. At one point, he wandered over. General Thornton greeted him cordially. "Derek." Then he pivoted back to me, and continued our exchange. The irony was not lost on me. For years, my husband had dismissed my military career as a mere footnote, yet some of the nation's most accomplished professionals clearly thought otherwise. Still, Derek seemed untroubled. If anything, he appeared amused, as though this were mere nostalgia among retirees, as though none of it carried real weight. I almost pitied him, because he had absolutely no inkling of what was about to unfold. A few minutes later, a bell chimed softly through the ballroom. Guests began returning to their tables. The evening's program was about to commence. People settled into their seats. The chairman approached the podium. Derek relaxed beside me. The room gradually fell silent. Then the chairman smiled and uttered words that made several attendees sit up straighter. "Before we proceed, there's someone special we'd like to acknowledge this evening." My stomach clenched. Across the room, General Thornton slowly turned toward me and smiled. The ballroom held its breath. More than 200 people faced the stage. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath the chandeliers. The chairman adjusted the microphone and continued. "Before we move forward with tonight's agenda, there is an individual in this room whom we must honor." A few guests exchanged puzzled glances. I felt my stomach tighten further, not because I didn't anticipate what was coming, but because I did. General Thornton's expression from across the room told me everything. Someone had orchestrated this, likely months earlier, and somehow no one had alerted me. The chairman pressed on. Many years ago, a crisis threatened careers, missions, and the reputations of several leaders seated in this very hall. The audience listened intently. Derek sat beside me, sipping his bourbon, still at ease, still oblivious. The chairman nodded toward the front table. General Matthews, a 4-star general, rose to his feet. Even in retirement, he carried himself with unassailable authority. The room instinctively straightened. Some habits never fade around a 4-star. General Matthews accepted the microphone. He surveyed the ballroom slowly. Then he lifted his glass to Valkyrie. For an instant, nobody moved. Then dozens of faces broke into warm smiles. People recognized that name, not everyone, but enough. The applause began near the front and spread like wildfire. Within moments, the entire ballroom erupted. Guests rose, chairs scraped across the floor, hands clapped with fervor, and some even whistled. I lowered my gaze briefly, embarrassed, grateful, overwhelmed. Beside me, Derek froze. I could practically sense the confusion radiating from him. He glanced around the room, then at me, then back toward the stage. General Matthews waited for the ovation to subside. Then he smiled. Most of you are familiar with the story. Several people laughed softly. He gestured toward me, though she would never recount it herself. More laughter. That part was undeniably true. I never had. General Matthews continued. 20 years ago, a small intelligence team uncovered information that prevented one of the most significant professional disasters many of us would have ever faced. The room grew quieter. No one was looking at him anymore. They were looking at me. Derek slowly lowered his glass. I stared at the tablecloth, wishing I could dissolve into the woodwork, but the general was far from finished. There are officers in this room who made errors. A few people chuckled nervously. There are officers in this room who received faulty intelligence. More nods. There are officers in this room who would have lost everything had that intelligence not been corrected. The room became deathly silent. Then the general lifted his glass once more and delivered the sentence that altered everything. She saved every career in this room. No applause this time, just stunned silence, followed by something even more powerful. People rose again, every single person. A standing ovation, lengthier than the first, more thunderous, more profound. The chairman was clapping. Retired generals were clapping. Pentagon officials were clapping. Individuals who had spent entire careers earning respect were standing for me. Across the ballroom, I noticed tears glistening in one woman's eyes. Another retired officer nodded toward me with quiet reverence. And beside me, Derek choked on his drink. He coughed so violently that he had to grab his napkin. His face flushed crimson, then paled, then crimson again. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. General Matthews waited patiently, then he added one final reflection. The remarkable aspect isn't merely what she accomplished. The room hushed once more. It's that she never sought recognition afterward. His eyes met mine. She simply returned to work. Somehow, those words struck deeper than everything else because they rang true. I hadn't wanted awards or speeches or applause. I had simply done my duty, the way thousands of military men and women do every single day. General Matthews stepped away from the podium. The chairman resumed, but before he could proceed, another guest stood. Then another, then another. People began streaming toward my table, one by one. A retired admiral clasped my hand. "Wonderful to see you again, Colonel." A former Pentagon director beamed. "I've wanted to express my gratitude for years." Another officer laughed. "My promotion would have evaporated without you." Each interaction seemed to diminish Derek further, rendering him quieter, smaller, more uncomfortable. For years he had introduced me as someone who did government work. Now, some of the nation's most accomplished figures were queuing up to speak with me, not him. Me. The disparity was impossible to ignore. Eventually, General Thornton reached our table. He shook my hand warmly. Then he turned his gaze directly on Derek. For a moment, I thought he might offer something diplomatic, something polite. Instead, he frowned slightly. "Derek," he said. "Yes?" The general smiled thinly. "You never told us she was your wife." The words landed like a sledgehammer. A few nearby guests laughed, not cruelly, just genuinely surprised. Derek opened his mouth. Nothing emerged. For perhaps the first time in our marriage, he genuinely had no response. General Thornton patted his shoulder, then pivoted back to me. "The chairman would like you at the front table." I blinked. "What?" "Come on, Colonel." He smiled. "They've been waiting all evening." As I rose from my chair, I glanced at Derek. He stared back at me, not angry, not embarrassed, not even defensive. For the first time in years, he looked like a man suddenly realizing how little he truly knew about the person beside him. And somehow, that realization stung more than all the dismissive comments I had endured. The drive home was silent, not the comfortable quiet that follows a pleasant evening, not the serene hush of two people who know each other intimately. This silence carried weight, the kind that settles between two individuals and refuses to budge. Derek drove. I gazed out the passenger window. Washington's lights blurred past in the darkness. For nearly 20 minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Derek cleared his throat. "Margaret." I kept my eyes fixed on the window. "Yes." I didn't know. The words hung in the air, simple, honest, and utterly inadequate. I turned toward him. "You didn't know what?" He gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Any of it." For a moment, I almost laughed, not because it was amusing, but because it was staggering. After 35 years of marriage, my husband was finally admitting he didn't recognize who I was. The revelation seemed to wound him as much as it wounded me. "You never asked," I said quietly. Derek flinched. The truth often has that effect. For the remainder of the drive, neither of us spoke. When we reached home, I kicked off my heels and headed toward the kitchen. The house felt strangely altered, as though something had shifted, as though a curtain had finally been drawn back. Derek followed me inside. Neither of us changed clothes. Neither of us retired to bed. Instead, we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we had celebrated birthdays, paid bills, helped our children with homework, and discussed retirement plans. Tonight, it felt like foreign territory. Derek stared at his hands. Then he finally articulated it. "I'm sorry." I nodded politely, but I didn't respond, because apologies are easy. Understanding is far more arduous. After several seconds, he looked up. "What happened to us?" The question startled me, not because he asked it, but because he genuinely seemed perplexed, as though the answer had materialized out of thin air, as though tonight had caused the problem rather than exposing it. I folded my hands together. "What happened is that you stopped seeing me." His eyes widened slightly. I pressed on. "You didn't stop loving me." His shoulders relaxed. Then I added, "But you stopped seeing me." The relief evaporated. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Finally, I spoke again. "Do you know what hurt most tonight?" The things I said? No. The comments over the years? No. Derek looked bewildered. I leaned back in my chair. What hurt most was realizing that complete strangers knew more about my career than my own husband. The words landed heavily because they were true. Derek lowered his eyes. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned out years ago. What remained was disappointment, a quieter emotion, a heavier one. I recounted the dinner parties, the introductions, the jokes, the interruptions, the countless times someone had asked me a question and Derek had answered for me. I wasn't accusing him, merely describing reality. By the time I finished, his face looked drained. "I never meant to hurt you. I know." That was the tragedy. I truly did know. Derek wasn't cruel or abusive or malicious. The damage stemmed from something else: neglect, assumption, complacency, the belief that after decades together, there was nothing left to discover about the person beside you. The next morning, I expected things to return to normal. Instead, the phone started ringing incessantly. At 9, General Thornton called. At 10:30, another retired officer called, then another, then another. Each conversation was warm, friendly, filled with memories, stories, and respect. Derek heard every single one. Around lunchtime, I walked into the living room and found him sitting quietly in his armchair. The television was on, but he wasn't watching it. He was deep in thought. The phone rang again. This time, it was a retired, 3-star general. The conversation lasted nearly half an hour. When I hung up, Derek spoke without looking at me. What did he want? Just to say hello? Derek nodded. A few moments passed. Then he asked a question I had waited years to hear. What exactly did you do? Not sarcastically, not dismissively, not as a joke. Genuinely, honestly, curiously. I stared at him. For a second, I couldn't speak, because after all these years, he was finally asking. That afternoon, we sat together for hours, and for the first time in decades, I told him stories. Not classified information, not secrets, just stories. The human side of service, the sacrifices, the responsibility, the loneliness, the pressure, the victories, the failures, the moments that shaped me. Derek listened, truly listened. No interruptions, no jokes, no phone checking, no subject changing, just listening. At one point, his eyes glistened with tears. I had no idea. I believed him, because if he had understood, he never would have spoken to me the way he had. The sun was beginning to set when he finally looked at me, not through me, at me. Margaret? Yes. He swallowed hard. Can you give me one more chance to get this right? For the first time in a very long time, I saw not the confident defense consultant, not the man who craved attention, not the husband who had taken me for granted. I saw the young man I had married 35 years ago, and I realized he was finally ready to learn who his wife truly was. Change did not happen overnight. Life rarely works that way. There was no dramatic speech, no grand romantic gesture, no surprise vacation, no miracle moment that erased years of hurt. Instead, there were small things, simple things, the kinds of things that seem insignificant until you have lived without them. A week after the gala, Derek asked if I wanted to have breakfast together. Just breakfast, no agenda, no distractions. During the meal, he asked questions, real questions, not the polite kind people pose while waiting for their turn to speak, but the kind asked by someone genuinely seeking to understand. What was your hardest deployment? What did you miss most while you were away? Were you ever scared? Sometimes I answered immediately, sometimes I needed a moment, not because the memories were classified, but because they were personal. For years, I had stopped expecting anyone to ask, especially him. Now, he listened to every answer. The more we talked, the more I realized something surprising. Derek wasn't discovering a new version of me. He was discovering the version that had always existed, the version he had slowly stopped noticing. One afternoon, we were sorting through old boxes in the attic. Boxes neither of us had opened in years. Inside were photographs, army ceremonies, family holidays, promotion celebrations, pictures of our children when they were small. At one point, Derek found a photograph taken shortly after my promotion to colonel. I remembered the day immediately. The pride, the responsibility, the excitement. Derek stared at the picture for a long time. Then he shook his head. I can't believe I forgot what this meant to you. I looked at the photograph, then at him. You didn't forget. He looked confused. You just stopped paying attention. The old Derek might have become defensive. The new Derek simply nodded, because he knew I was right. That honesty became the foundation of everything that followed. Weeks turned into months. Gradually, our conversations deepened, not only about my experiences, but about his as well. For the first time in years, we talked about fears, regrets, aging, retirement, the uncertainty that comes with growing older. The truth was that Derek had spent years chasing importance, building a reputation, collecting recognition, seeking validation. Somewhere along the way, he had started measuring value by visibility. If something wasn't public, it seemed less significant. The gala changed that, because he finally saw something he should have understood long ago. Some of the most important contributions happen quietly, without applause, without headlines, without anyone knowing, including the people closest to us. One evening, several months after the gala, we attended a local Veterans Appreciation event. Nothing fancy, just a community gathering, folding chairs, coffee, patriotic decorations, veterans from different generations sharing stories. The atmosphere was warm and familiar, the kind of event I always enjoyed. As Derek and I walked through the room, a woman approached us. She looked to be in her 70s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She extended her hand toward me. "Thank you for your service." I smiled. "Thank you." Then she asked the question I had heard countless times throughout my life. "What branch did you serve in?" Before I could answer, Derek spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just naturally. "Army." The woman smiled. Derek continued, "My wife served for 31 years. The woman looked impressed. But Derek wasn't finished. A warm smile crossed his face. "You should hear what she accomplished." I looked at him. For a moment, the room seemed to dissolve. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. There was no performance, no attempt to impress anyone, no desire to borrow my accomplishments. Only pride, respect, admiration, the things I had been missing for years. The woman listened as Derek spoke about my service, about sacrifice, about commitment, about character. When he finished, she shook my hand again. Then she thanked both of us. As she walked away, Derek looked at me. "I finally understand something." "What?" He smiled softly. "The most remarkable person in my life was sitting right beside me the whole time." I laughed. "You took your time figuring that out." "Yeah," he admitted, "I did." We stood there together, older now, wiser, hopefully, certainly, more honest. The gala had not saved our marriage. The truth had. The willingness to listen had. The courage to admit mistakes had. And the decision to truly see each other again had. Before this story concludes, I would like to leave you with one thought. Sometimes the people we love carry burdens, accomplishments, sacrifices, and stories we barely notice, not because they are hiding them, but because we have stopped looking. If this narrative reminded you of someone in your own life, a spouse, a parent, a veteran, a friend, take a moment to ask about their story. You may discover something extraordinary. And as we wrap up, I want to extend a heartfelt thank you for listening to this tale of rediscovery and quiet heroism. If it resonated with you, please take a moment to share it with someone who might need the reminder. Don't forget to like this video and let me know in the comments what you thought of Margaret and Derek's journey. Where are you watching from today? I'd love to hear your city and your perspective. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Revenge Story Narrator for more stories about resilience, second chances, and the everyday heroes among us. Because respect should never begin after public recognition, it should begin at home. The end.